Francesco Farioli's Porto are a really interesting team because on the surface, a lot of what they do looks quite simple because they are very rigid with their shape and with their intentions, but looking simple doesn't necessarily make it simple, and like in most cases, the devil is in the detail. They have an intense blend of freedom but without compromising positional responsibility. The structure is crucial to Farioli's tactical identity with and without the ball. Off the ball, they're a tough nut to crack. Top-level defensive coaching has been a theme of Farioli's coaching throughout his relatively short career so far, so let's break his Porto tactics down. Porto's build-up and their attacking shape are actually very similar. Both are essentially a 2-3-5. The major difference during the first phase is obviously Diogo Costa. He is genuinely one of the key components of their possession game. Farioli wants Porto to invite pressure. They don't necessarily want the easiest forward pass immediately. They want the opposition to commit players towards them because Costa effectively gives Porto an additional outfield player in that first line. If the opposition press Porto man for man, Costa creates the spare man, and from there, the objective is fairly straightforward. Draw the press, find the spare player, break through it. But actually finding that free player is where Porto's third man combinations become really important. Typically, Varela or Rosario occupy the pivot position between the Porto fullbacks, with Froholt and Gabby Veiga positioned further forward as the two number 8. Costa can receive the ball and deliberately attract pressure towards himself. If an opposition forward then jumps from Kivior or Bednarak, Porto can use the pivot as the bounce player. Costa into Rosario can then quickly release the ball to the spare player, and suddenly the centre-back has the ability to look up and play forward. Simple passes individually, but collectively, they're constantly changing who the opposition actually need to mark. And Porto have another solution as well. One of the more advanced midfielders, usually Veiga or Froholt, can drop into the gap between the pivot and the fullback. And this movement can overload build-up situations, causing a player marking the pivot or a fullback to panic. Or if he is followed by his marker, then the space between the opponent's press and defensive line becomes greater. This is where Farioli's love for the third man run becomes noticeable. If the pass goes to the pivot or the dropping 8, then the fullbacks could be ready to move in behind their marker and receive a quick pass. Or the fullback can be the target for the first pass, with the midfielders moving behind their markers to receive. Or use the far side 8, who has remained high, to make a lateral movement into a larger amount of space and receive the pass. The possibilities are limitless. They use these sequences to create that spare man and get somebody receiving the ball behind the press rather than directly into it. And once Porto escape that first wave, they don't want to spend another 15 passes admiring their work. They attack. The receiver can carry the ball aggressively into space, look immediately for one of the attackers running beyond the defence, or find a winger isolated up against a fullback. And that leads into one of the biggest themes of Farioli's Porto: verticality. Naturally, Porto spend a lot of the time attacking deep opposition blocks domestically. Once they've established possession high up the pitch, that 2-3-5 becomes incredibly clear. The two centre-backs remain underneath the attack, the pivot sits ahead of them, and the full-backs move much narrower than you might expect. They're almost playing within half spaces rather than remaining as traditional overlapping full-backs, and that does two things. Firstly, it gives Porto shorter passing distances for combination play and the ability to recycle the ball, or if possession breaks down, they've immediately got players close enough to counter-press. And not just counter-press, but it gives them an extremely strong rest defence. The fullbacks, the pivot and the centre-backs generally remain in front of the opposition's defensive shape. So if Porto lose possession, they aren't suddenly asking two centre-backs to defend acres of space on the outside or in behind. There is always protection around them. And I think that is particularly important when looking at the personnel Porto have. This isn't necessarily an incredibly athletic spine where you would want huge distances appearing between players. So Farioli minimises those distances, and Porto's excellent defensive record isn't just because they defend well once opponents reach their box. A lot of it comes from making sure opponents don't get that opportunity to attack open space in the first place. The structure protects the individuals. And where Porto become much more interesting is that the 2-3-5 is rigid in terms of the occupation, it isn't rigid in terms of personnel. Players do rotate, but there is one fundamental rule. If you leave a space, somebody has to replace you. We've already seen 3 different players used at right back across the opening 3 games of the season, but whoever plays there tends to be a more attacking option than Zaidu Sanusi on the left. And because Porto's right back is more aggressive, the team shape naturally begins to distort towards that side. When the ball progresses down the right, Porto shift across with it. Players remain close together so possession can constantly be recycled. Now logically, you might assume that if the right back advances, Froholt playing as the right-sided number 8 would simply drop in and replace him. But that's generally not what happens. Instead, it's often Gabby Veiga, and Veiga can do this in a couple of different ways. He can drop deeper into the pivot position, which allows Varela or Rosario to move across and occupy the vacant fullback zone. Or, more dramatically, Vega can almost travel completely across the midfield and occupy that right-back position himself. At the same time, Froholt shifts across into the left-sided number 8 space, and it sounds extremely complicated when you describe it player by player, but visually the idea is very simple. The 2-3-5 remains intact, the players occupying each point have simply changed, and the reason Vega is trusted with that responsibility is his technical quality. He can receive deeper, he can receive facing his own goal, and most importantly, once he receives, he has the quality to find the forward pass. Vega is probably the closest thing that Porto have to a genuine free spirit within this system. Other players rotate, but his licence is noticeably greater. Farioli gives him freedom because Vega has the technical quality to turn those movements into progression, and none of that is meant to diminish Froholt, however. Quite the opposite. From even my brief interactions with Porto supporters, it's pretty obvious how highly they rate the young Dane. Where Vega offers that freedom and technical connectivity, Froholt gives Porto something different. Power, movement, penetration. He normally wants to operate high, almost alongside the forward line, and he's constantly looking for gaps to attack. If there's space behind the defensive line, he'll run into it. If there's a gap between defenders, he'll attack it. And when Porto can cross from the opposite side, he'll attack the far post. We saw that against Terenza, where his movement created a headed opportunity at the back post. He's also brilliant at supporting the winger on his side. If Gomez receives wide and pulls the opposition fullback towards him, Froholt is already looking at the channel between the fullback and the centre-back. Again, making the most of third-man movements. And that's what makes this movement so dangerous. The winger doesn't need to beat his defender, he can simply slide the pass down the side of him because Froholt has already attacked that gap. And he's not simply a runner either. He can create in the final third, he can combine, he can arrive in goal-scoring positions. Physically, he gives Porto a presence that not many other players in this midfield do. The relationships between Vega, Froholt and the striker are probably the most important attacking dynamics within this team. Samo is Porto's first choice striker, but last season he suffered a major injury that will keep him out for some time. Regardless of who exactly plays in the middle, the role is absolutely vital, because Porto's attacking football is built around depth. They don't want everybody coming towards the ball. The striker will often drop into midfield when spaces open up between the pivots, but crucially, the movement is normally a trigger rather than the end goal. As the striker drops, the 8s go the other way. Vega, and particularly Froholt, can immediately attack the space behind the defence. So Porto can create opposite movements. One player comes short, another goes long, and suddenly defenders have a horrible decision to make. And because Porto are constantly looking vertically, the pass over the top is always available if the defensive line steps forward. That is the major characteristic of their possession game. They don't just circulate the ball just for control. They're constantly asking, can we play forward? Can we break a line? Can we attack the space in behind and get as close to goal as possible? And if that first attack doesn't produce a chance, Porto simply squeeze the pitch. The structure moves higher, the inverted fullbacks become easy recycling options, the pivot holds the centre, and when opponents become extremely deep, even Kivior and Bednarak can find themselves positioned inside the final third. That's how Porto sustain pressure. They compress the entire game into a tiny area, and because their rest defence is already in place, every clearance becomes simply another opportunity to attack. It's not necessarily relentless because they're throwing everybody forward, it's relentless because they make the pitch so small that the opposition struggles to escape. And defensively, Porto are actually quite adaptable. Whether they're pressing high or defending in a deeper block, there are some consistent principles. The striker will generally begin by taking one centre-back, but Porto won't necessarily send one of the central midfielders to take the other. Instead, the winger jumps onto the spare centre-back. The full-back behind him can then push onto the opposition full-back, who has now been vacated, and the rest of the defensive line shifts across accordingly. This works particularly well down Porto's left. Kivior is far more comfortable defending wider spaces and moving towards the touchline. Bednarak, by comparison, is better when he can remain more central. So Porto can slightly adjust their pressing behaviour depending on which side they're defending. The pivot is incredibly important here as well, because Varela or Rosario effectively determines what Porto's defensive shape becomes. They can stay between midfield and defensive lines to protect the number 10 space, or they can drop directly into the defensive line and turn Porto into a back 5. And if an opposition attacking midfielder remains high, the pivot can simply occupy that space and plug the gap. So although Porto's attacking shape is extremely recognisable, their defensive shape is much more fluid. When Porto drop into a deeper block, the most obvious thing is just how compact they become. The distances between the lines are tiny. The central spaces are incredibly crowded, but Porto are not passive. They're waiting for pressing triggers. One of the biggest is simply a backwards pass. The moment the opponent goes backwards, Porto see an opportunity to squeeze forward. Again, the winger presses from outside to inside. The fullback then engages behind him, and the defensive line shifts across. And suddenly Porto have turned what looked like harmless opposition possession into a situation where they're facing their own goal, panicking, and everything comes back to protecting the middle. Farioli is happy for opponents to have certain passes. What Porto don't want to give away is access through the centre of the pitch. which is exactly why the winger jumps towards a centre-back instead of any of Porto's midfielders. And that's probably the best way to summarise Francesco Farioli's Porto. This is a team built around structured freedom, and behind all of it sits an extremely compact rest defence structure that allows Porto to attack without consistently exposing themselves in transition, which means Farioli has created something that every coach wants, a team that can be fluid without becoming disorganised, and considering the combination of Porto's attacking talent, their defensive record, and the clarity already visible within these principles, this could become a very, very difficult Porto side to stop.